The crash site burned in the distance, fire carving orange scars into the night air. Smoke rolled off twisted alloy and vanished into the sea wind. Warner Dross tightened his jaw and descended the slope of black sand, each step crunching sharp against the grit. He knew better than to walk toward wreckage. Wrecks were graves more often than they were opportunities. They exploded, they drew scavengers, and they carried ghosts no sane man wanted to shoulder. But he had seen movement, and movement was enough. Air thickened with the acrid tang of scorched hull plating. He scanned the angles of smoke the way he once read a battlefield, gauging collapse times and wind shifts. His body moved with the old rhythm-balanced, steady knife at his belt, eyes cutting through glare for what others missed. A shape lurched from the wreck's mouth, thin legs staggering beneath a burden. Warner stilled, narrowing his gaze. Not cargo, not salvage. A woman. Her garments were burned through at the shoulders and thighs, clinging damp against skin that shimmered faintly purple beneath the soot. She should have collapsed already, but pride forced her upright dot in her arms. A bundle jerked and gave a broken cry. Warner's breath tightened. An infant. The woman's knees buckled, and she would have fallen had he not moved. He crossed the sand in 3 quick strides and caught her before she crumbled. "Don't touch me," she rasped, voice hoarse but sharp. "You'll burn if you stay." Her defiance might have stopped a softer man. Warner didn't bother answering. Words were time wasted. He shifted his stance, hooked an arm beneath both mother and child, and lifted them against his chest. The baby trembled, weak but alive, pressed under the edge of his cloak. The wreck behind them screamed with tearing metal. Warner didn't look back. He carried them uphill, boots punching into the sand, until the roar of fire dulled behind stone. Walls. His house was carved into the cliff, a refuge of ordered tools and silence. Tonight it filled with the cries of an infant and the wary eyes of a stranger. He lowered the woman onto the bench by the wall. The child's breathing hitched, quick and shallow. Warner checked first for heat in her skin, breath in her lungs. Life still clinging. Relief flickered through him, sharp and unexpected. He forced his face blank and turned to the mother. Her shoulders were square, despite burns. Her pale green eyes locked on him, wary and proud. She did not thank him. She demanded to know his reason with her silence alone. "Irene," she said finally, voice rough, as if giving him her name cost something. "Warner," he replied, already filling the kettle with water from his stores. He ground furlan seeds, the sharp scent pushing back the stink of smoke. The baby whimpered again. Irene held her close, but her hands shook. Warner poured crow root broth into a cup, cooled it, and slid it across the table. "Drink?" Her suspicion flared. Then she sipped, slow, throat moving with the swallow. She passed the cup back for the child. Warner thinned it further and guided. The rim toward the infant's lips. Irene steadied his hand as the baby latched weakly, the sound of sucking breaking the tension. Warner's chest eased for the first time since he saw the fire. He studied the woman openly. Her burns were real, her exhaustion deeper than most men could carry, yet her eyes held steel. Pride had not burned with the transport. She wanted to know why he had stopped when most would not. "You were a soldier?" she said at last, noting the scars on his ribs, the way he kept his back to the wall. "Was," Warner answered. "Now tide harvester. Quiet work." "Quiet. Doesn't last," she murmured. "People will come. They always come." He glanced at the door, at the faint red glow still rising from the beach. She wasn't wrong. For now, though, she and the child were breathing, and that was mission enough. He laid a blanket across the cot. "Rest. I'll keep watch." Irene studied him once more, suspicion and pride warring across her face, then shifted onto the bed, with the infant at her chest. Warner took the chair by the door, back straight, boots planted, eyes on the window slit and the dark horizon beyond. He had come here to escape war, to cut tides and live in silence. Yet tonight, silence had broken. With fire, with a woman's defiance, and with a child's fragile cry. He did not know if he had saved survivors or invited burdens. But as the baby's breathing steadied into a softer rhythm, Warner accepted what instinct had already decided. For now, their lives were his to guard. The night pressed close around the stone house, wind seeping through narrow cracks and whistling. Faintly, Warner Dross sat rigid in the chair by the door, knife within arm's reach, gaze fixed on the shadows that swayed against the slit of a window. His body remembered the rhythm of watch duty, how to breathe steady, how to let small sounds separate into categories: wind, surf, shifting stone. But his ears kept circling back to the quiet inside, the rustle of fabric, the small hitch of the child's breath, the faint murmur of Irene as she shifted on the cot. She had given him her name like a weapon handed over under protest. Irene. He turned it over in his head, attaching it to the proud tilt of her jaw, the pale green light of her eyes, the defiance that survived burns and loss. She did not trust him. That was fine. Trust wasn't needed yet. Survival was. Near dawn, the infant stirred with a sharp whimper. Warner rose before Irene could push herself upright. He crossed the room in 3 soundless steps, poured warm water into a clay cup, dipped a strip of cloth, and wrung it out. Irene's gaze followed his hand as he offered it. For a heartbeat she hesitated, suspicion tightening her mouth. Then she took it and dabbed the baby's lips with surprising gentleness. Her voice dropped into a low rhythm, words in a tongue he didn't know. The child calmed, breath falling, into a softer rhythm. "You don't ask why I was there," she said suddenly, eyes never leaving the infant. "You'll tell me if you want to." Warner's tone carried no weight, no pressure. Her jaw flexed. The silence stretched, heavy. As tide rocks, then broke. It was not a military ship. It carried families. Mine was one. Her hand trembled once as she touched the baby's cheek. "My mate is gone, burned with the others." Warner didn't shift, didn't lower his gaze. He let her words fill the room and settle. Sometimes silence gave people more space than answers. "I thought no human would stop for me," she said after a long pause. "Your kind rarely does. I'm not most." The answer landed harder than he intended. She searched his face for arrogance, for pity, for any crack to exploit. She found none. Finally, she lay back, pulling the child tight against her chest. When morning light seeped gray across the sea, Warner stood at the slit window, arms folded, watching foam drift against the rocks. The wreck still burned down. The coast, its smoke curling into the sky like a signal. Silence was not guaranteed. Behind him, Irene stirred, the oversized shirt he had given her slipping from one shoulder. Alana still slept, fragile breath pressed against her mother's collarbone. Irene's eyes opened slowly, scanning the house with quick, measuring glances. Her gaze took in the neat tools, the bare walls, the lack of softness. "You live like a soldier still," she said, voice hushed but steady. "I live like someone who doesn't want surprises." He turned, set water to boil, and ground furlan seeds until the bitter scent filled the chamber. She shifted upright, adjusting the sling, her burned shoulder pulling tight with the motion. She tried to mask the pain, but Warner saw it anyway. "What work keeps you here?" she asked. "Tide harvester. Coral growths, glass kelp. Cut, dry, sell inland. It pays for this house. Keeps me breathing." Her lips tightened as she studied him, then she looked down at the child. "And now?" Warner paused, pouring dark coffee into 2 cups. He set one beside her without ceremony. Now plans change. She sniffed the bitter drink, then lifted it, face shifting at the taste, but swallowing anyway. Pride demanded she drink what he did. Pride demanded she show she was not dependent, even as her hands trembled. Warner sat across from her. For the first time since the wreck, the silence felt less like absence and more like negotiation. 2 lives weighing each other, deciding if this refuge of stone and salt could hold more than one heart and the fragile hope of a child. The decision wasn't made yet, but the fire outside was dying, and the child inside was still breathing. That was enough for now. The days after the fire fell into a rhythm, though not the quiet rhythm Warner Dross had once carved out for himself. The tide still came and went. The sea still dragged kelp to the rocks and clawed at the rig brackets. But now every sound was joined by another, the soft hum Irene made as she rocked her child. The creak of the cradle Warner had built from salvage, a faint stir of small breaths in the night. He rose early, as always, and strapped the harness across his chest, coil clipped tight. Normally, he would descend to the rigs alone, letting his body work against the sea's weight until his thoughts turned clear. But when he stepped to the door that morning, Irene stood there already, a liney bound to her chest with a sling. She wore his long shirt belted with her shawl, sleeves rolled to her elbows. The burn on her collarbone was still raw, but her eyes had sharpened. "You said work keeps you alive," she said. "Then let me work. You'll tear your wound open." "I know how to cut kelp without tearing a living line," she replied. Her voice carried not arrogance, but memory, the sound of someone who had once known boats and rope. Warner studied her a moment longer. Then he handed her a short hook knife and a basket. "You stay on the ledge. Cut only the wide leaves. If your shoulder pulls, stop." She gave the smallest nod, accepting the turns like a truce. Together, they stepped into the salt air. On the rocks above the rigs, Irene crouched with steady hands, slicing kelp from where waves had thrown it high. Every so often she paused, scanning the horizon before returning to her task. Warner saw the vigilance and said nothing. He worked the southern rig, tightening bolts, scraping barnacle, resetting floats. A spray stung his face, the cold anchoring him in the present. He glanced up once to find Irene binding her harvest into neat bundles. Clean cuts, no waste. He filed it away without comment. By midday they returned to the house, baskets heavy with wet leaves. Warner showed her his method salting. The kelp, stacking it on racks so the water would draw out without rotting. She listened with sharp attention, not wasting questions. When he finished, she crouched low, traced the grooves he had carved into the stone by the racks. "Your marks," she said. "They track days." "Harvest and where?" Warner confirmed. 5 years. Her hand lingered on the grooves. "You plan to be alone?" "Yes." He didn't soften it. "But plans change." At evening, while the racks dried under canvas, a dark shape knocked against the tide rocks below. Warner hauled it up with a hook, a carbon case, latch bent, foam-soaked, but intact. Passenger registries. Ships always carried them, sealed against water. "Open it," Irene said, voice tight. Inside lay a polymer sheet, names lined in neat script. Warner scanned quickly, finger running the columns. He found the row she had spoken of the night before. Vernal, Section B, Row 4. A note, scrawled in another hand. Heat breach near B4. No retrieval logged. Irene's jaw locked. Her eyes did not wet. She stared at the words as if staring long enough might change them. Then she spoke with no tremor, no plea. "Then his body is in the water, or ash." Warner folded the sheet, slid it back into the tube, then into the case. He closed it carefully and set it aside. We'll give him weight tonight. Her gaze flicked to him, uncertain. You do rites for people you didn't know? I do closure for the living. At dusk they carried the case to the waterline. Warner filled a shallow bowl with tide water, dipped his fingers, and let 3 drops fall. For the place he stood, he said. He handed the bowl to her. She repeated the gesture, voice low. For the work he did, she held the rim to the sling where Eleni slept. For the life he left. Warner wedged the case between rocks where the sea would take it at midnight. Some things belong to the water. Irene's shoulders lowered a fraction, not from surrender, but from the release of carrying a truth spoken aloud. Back inside, Warner warmed broth and crisped root strips on the hot plate. Irene ate slowly at first, then with more intent. Eleni stirred once and calmed at her mother's hum. Warner kept his face still, but inside he felt the shift. The house no longer echoed only with his silence. It carried breath, words, and the fragile beginnings of something larger than survival. For the first time, he wondered if this tide harvester's dwelling could hold more than one life. It might hold 3, and together they might outlast the wreckage fire fading on the horizon. The sea gave no warning. One moment its rhythm was steady, the next it heaved with a violence that rattled the stone walls of Warner's house. Wind clawed through the window slit, carrying brine and grit that stung the eyes. The lamp guttered, shadows jerking like startled things across the room. Warner woke instantly, instinct snapping him upright. His ears picked out the wrong sound, a sharp metallic cry from outside. Not the slow groan of tide brackets, but the straining scream of iron about to tear. Irene was already on her feet, Eleni clutched tight in her sling. Her eyes locked with Warner's across the dim chamber. It sounds wrong, she said over. The howl, rigs pulling against the current. Warner yanked his harness down from the wall, clipped the coil to his belt. He moved with soldier's efficiency, but his chest tightened. If the southern bracket went, half their harvest would vanish, and the whole rig might tumble into the sea. He started for the door, then saw Irene at his side, shawl whipping in the draft, knife clutched in her free hand. Stay inside, he barked. I won't sit idle while you drown. Her jaw was set, her voice rough but unyielding. You'll guard the child. He forced authority into his tone. That's work only you can do. For a long moment her gaze clashed with his. Pride against command, instinct against structure. Then, without another word, she turned and wrapped both arms around Eleni, planting herself by the door. It was a soldier's compromise, not surrender. Shoved the door open. The storm struck him like a wall. Rain lashed sideways, salt spray cutting his face raw. The rig bucked below, southern brackets swinging loose, lines snapping like a whip. He moved fast, boots skidding on wet stone, hands locking around the wrench. His muscles burned as he wrenched bolts against the screaming pressure of tide, and weaned. He grunted with effort, shoulders braced against forces that would shear a weaker man in half. Behind him, a cry cut through the gale Eleni's high, panicked wail. Warner risked a glance. The door to the house stood ajar. Irene was outside. Shawl flung wild, child pressed to her chest as she fought for balance on the ledge. I told you to stay in. He roared, voice carried by wind. The wall cracked. She shouted back. Her words were jagged, breath tearing from her throat. Stones gave way safer out here. He saw it then. She was right. Water forced itself through gaps in the inner wall, dripping in streams. If she had stayed, she and the child would have been trapped in collapsing stone. Hold there, Warner barked. Don't move closer. He finished tightening the bracket, body shuddering with strain, then clipped the coil and hauled himself. Back up the ladder. His chest heaved, every muscle burning. When he reached her, he pressed a steadying hand to her lower back. She leaned against the support for only a second, but in that second, trust flickered beneath her defiance. Together, they braced against the storm until the worst of the gusts passed. When the wind finally dropped to a hard, steady push, the rig still held. Warner's body sagged with exhaustion, but he kept his stance firm. Irene's hair clung wet to her face, her shirt soaked, burn reopened and bleeding. Alani quieted, small hiccups fading against her mother's chest. "You risked both of you," Warner said flatly, his voice like iron scraped against stone. "You left me no choice." She shot back, but her lips trembled not with weakness, but with the weight of fear barely contained. He looked at her, at the blood streaking her collar, at the fierce grip she kept on the child. She had chosen wrong in leaving, but not out of recklessness. She had chosen to keep her child alive, even if it cost her everything. He understood it, even as anger twisted his chest. "Inside," he said, tone leaving no room for debate. Staggered back into the house, dripping water across the stone floor. Warner shoved the door closed, raced it with a beam, and stripped his harness with a clatter. Then he knelt beside her, pulled cloth from the shelf, and pressed it to her. "Wound." She hissed at the sting, but didn't flinch. "You're angry?" she asked, meeting his eyes without retreat. "Yes," he admitted. He tied the bandage firm, jaw tight. "Because if the sea had taken you, the child would have been alone again." Her eyes flickered, pride wavering just enough to let truth show. "I didn't think of myself. Only her. I know." Warner's voice softened, the edge dulling. He tied the last knot and stepped back. "But if you trust me, you let me take the risks outside. You protect her here." Silence pressed between them, heavy as the storm still battering the walls. Then Irene said, voice low but steady, "Trust doesn't come quickly for my kind." "Then here," he replied. She studied him, lips parting as if to say more, but she closed them again. She lay back on the cot, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. Warner sat in his chair by the door, eyes on the window slit, knife within. Reach, but his focus was not only on the storm outside. It was on her, and on the choice forming behind her eyes. That night, while the sea raged, the house held 3 breaths in fragile rhythm. A soldier who sought no more orders, a widow who bore no more debts, and a child who had known only fire. His storm hammered the coast, but inside, something steadier was being built. The first, uncertain shape of a family dawn crawled gray across the sea, light dragging itself over battered rigs and salt-streaked stone. The storm had left the coast. In a state of restless quiet foam still rolled high, but the fury had passed. Warner Dross stood at the window slit, arms folded, watching for movement that wasn't the tide. He saw only gulls circling the wreck far down the beach. Smoke was gone, the beacon snuffed. For now, they were invisible again. Behind him, Irene stirred on the cot. She shifted slowly, jaw tightening when the bandaged burn pulled against her. Collarbone. Alani still slept against her chest, tiny breaths rising and falling. Warner heard her whisper something low in her own tongue. Then she swung her legs to the floor. The shirt he'd given her hung loose, damp from the night before, but she didn't complain. Pride had carried her through fire, and it carried her. "Still, you didn't scold me this morning," she said quietly, eyes on the child. "I already did last night," Warner replied. He poured water into the kettle and set it on the coil. "Words don't make wounds close." Her gaze lifted, pale green catching the faint light. "You think I disobeyed. I think you acted without trust." His voice stayed calm, iron under stone. "You thought I couldn't hold the sea alone." She stiffened, lips pressing together. Should I have sat idle with the wall cracking? Tell my child her protector went under while I stayed chained to your chair? Warner turned, meeting her stare. He set 2 cups on the table, steam beginning to curl from the kettle. If I drown, you still breathe. If you fall, the child dies with you. That's the difference. The words cut, and she let them. Her hand tightened on the sling strap until her knuckles paled. Silence stretched, heavy as the tide. Then she spoke, softer, but edged with old grief. I have lived with loss too long to measure risk like you do. For me, everything is a threat. Warner drew in a breath, poured coffee black and bitter into both cups. He slid one across the table toward her. You asked me why I left the Corps, why I live on this coast. I'll give you the rest now. She raised her eyes, wary but listening. I fought too many fights that weren't mine, he said. Orders dressed as justice, missions dressed as duty. I carried bodies of men I never knew, same as their enemies carried ours. It broke something. So I came here, where the sea asks only for strength and steady hands. No orders, no debts, just work. He sipped, bitterness anchoring him. When I found you in that fire, I had 2 choices. Walk away and keep silence, or carry you out and let this place stop being mine alone. I chose the second. Don't make me regret it. The silence after was thick enough to fill the chamber. Irene's shoulders rose and fell, breath unsteady. She looked at Alani, who stirred and blinked pale green eyes open. Tiny hands reached toward the cradle's edge. Warner rested a finger there, and the child clutched him with surprising force. You speak of choice, Irene said, voice low, but I had none. My mate burned, my people scattered. All I had was this child. She looked at him again, something raw in her eyes. Survival forced me here. And now? Warner asked, steady. Are you still forced, or are you choosing? Her lips parted, then closed again. She looked at the infant gripping Warner's finger, her small fists clinging with stubborn life. Irene's voice cracked just slightly. She trusts you. And you? For the first time, suspicion did not harden her face. Instead, it gave way to exhaustion, to honesty, and to the barest shape of surrender. I want to. Warner didn't move closer. He let silence hold the weight of her words. Trust couldn't be demanded. It had to be placed. He pushed a plate of roasted root toward her instead. Eat. Work waits. Trust will come when it's earned. She reached for the food, her hand brushing his as she took the bowl. Neither pulled back at once. For a long moment, the room held no emptiness. It held choice, fragile but real, as if the 3 of them were beginning to claim the harder path together. The day turned sharp and bright, the sea restless but no longer raging. Warner Dross strapped his harness and worked the rigs in silence, muscles steady against the pull of tide. Irene kept to the ledge, basket at her side, blade flashing quick and clean. Eleni dozed in her sling, her small breaths keeping time with the waves. They spoke little, but Warner noticed how easily her cuts matched his marks, how she no longer asked about his methods. She worked as if she had always belonged on these rocks. By dusk, the racks lay heavy with salted kelp, canvas stretched taut against the coming dew. Warner checked each knot, his habit of precision refusing to loosen, even with exhaustion in his arms. Irene stacked bundles in neat rows, eyes constantly lifting toward the horizon. Her vigilance sharpened the air between them, though she never named what she feared. The sound reached them before the sight, a low hum of an engine riding the wind. Warner stiffened, head turning toward the bay. A vessel nosed into view, squat and ugly, lights hooded, hull patched with scrap. Scavengers. Irene's hand went to the sling, pressing Eleni closer. Her other hand found the knife. Her eyes flashed pale green in the fading light. "They'll smell survivors, and we make them believe otherwise." Warner's voice was even, though tension ran under it like drawn wire. He stepped onto the ledge, planting himself in plain view. The scavenger boat slowed, its crew leaning over the rails, faces lost in shadow. One cupped his hands and shouted, "Saw smoke inland. You hold the wreck?" Warner shook his head once, letting the lie sit flat. Ship burned clean. Nothing left but slag. "Funny," another called. "We hear it carried families. Cargo worth coin." At that, Irene stepped forward. She held her chin high, her knife flashing in the dying light. "Then your ears are liars. I searched the wreck myself. Nothing but ash and twisted plates." Her voice was steady, hard as tide rocks. Warner glanced at her once. She had not asked permission. She had simply joined the bluff, her tone convincing enough to carry truth. The scavengers muttered, their boat circling closer, but hesitation showed in their movements. Warner folded his arms, posture unbent, daring them to test him. Silence stretched, broken only by the slap of waves. At last, the boat turned, its engine grumbling as it nosed back toward open water. Only when the shape of the vessel shrank to a smear against the horizon did Irene lower her knife. She exhaled, her shoulders sagging for the first time all day. Warner's gaze stayed fixed on the fading boat. "You lied clean," he said. She looked at him, eyes still sharp. "I told truth enough to make them doubt. That's all a lie needs." For a moment, Warner saw her not as refugee, but as partner, standing shoulder to shoulder in the defense of something that mattered. The child stirred against her chest, small fists pressing against the sling, as if echoing the moment. Inside, when the door was barred and the lamp lit low, Warner sat across from Irene at the table. She fed Alani thinned broth, the infant swallowing with soft gulps. Warner's face softened without him meaning it. "You protected her," he said. Irene's lips pressed tight, but her eyes flicked to his. "We both did." Warner studied her across the flickering light. For the first time since fire had scarred the beach, he felt no division of roles, no weight of strangers under his roof. They had guarded the child together, not as soldier and widow, not as host and refugee, but as family. The storm had shown them how fragile trust could be. The scavengers had shown them how strong it could grow. And Warner realized, as he watched Irene tuck the child into the cradle he had built, that his house no longer held silence. It held allegiance, a unit, a fragile, unspoken family. Night draped itself heavy over the Vallis coast, the tide whispering against the rocks in long, even breaths. The lamp in Warner Dross's house burned low, casting amber light over the rough walls and the cradle at the center of the room. Alani stirred there, pale green eyes half open, one tiny hand curling and uncurling against the blanket. Warner sat in his chair by the door, posture straight as ever, though his body begged for rest. He had watched too many nights alone to change the habit in one. But tonight he was not the only one awake. That Irene sat across from him, back straight despite the raw bandage under her shirt. She had finished her share of salted kelp, rinsed the bowl clean, and laid it aside with the care of someone who never wasted effort. Now her gaze fixed on him, steady, unblinking. "You told me once," she said quietly, "that you don't keep debts. If I stay here, if we stay, will you see us as debt or as family?" Warner did not look away. The tide's hush filled the space between words. He leaned forward, arms on his knees, voice flat but certain. Choice, always choice. Something broke loose in her then, not pride, not suspicion, but a smaller, softer thing she had kept hidden since the wreck. For the first time she smiled. It wasn't wide, but it was real. She looked down at the child, then back at him, I thought no human would stop for me, she admitted, her voice rough with the weight of the confession. I thought you carried us out of fire by chance. But you should know the truth. She drew a breath, sharp, steadying. Eleni was marked. Warner's eyes narrowed. Marked? She slipped the sling aside, just enough to show the inside of the child's wrist. Under the lamp's glow, a faint scar shimmered, circular, branded into tender skin. Not burn, not birthmark. Warner knew it instantly. He had seen it in war zones, on prisoners catalogued as property. Slavers, Irene said, her voice dropping. The transport carried families fleeing a failing colony. But one hold carried more those taken in raids. Eleni was branded at birth as biological stock. If scavengers had found her, they wouldn't have left her to ash. They'd have sold her. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. Warner's jaw flexed hard enough to ache. His hand gripped the arm of the chair, tendons sharp under scarred skin. And you carried her through fire anyway. She is my mate's blood, Irene said, eyes burning. But more than that, she is mine. And now she is alive because you chose not to walk away. Warner rose from his chair, boots scraping against stone. He crossed to the cradle where the infant blinked up at him. Her small hand reached, gripping his finger as she had before, stubborn and sure. He looked down at her, then back at Irene. Then she isn't theirs, he said. She's ours to keep alive. Ours to guard. Irene stood as well, the fatigue in her body obvious, but she came to stand beside him. Her hand found his where it rested on the cradle's rim. She didn't flinch, didn't test. She pressed firm, sealing the moment like a vow. The storm outside was gone, the sea smoothed to glass. In its quiet rhythm, the house no longer felt like stone cut against emptiness. It felt inhabited by a soldier who wanted no more orders, a widow who bore no more debts, and a child who had known only fire, but now lay in warmth. No orders bound them, no oath spoken, yet a family had formed here. Not found, not forced, but chosen. And as the tide beat steady against the rock, Warner understood the silence he had once clung to was gone. What filled its place was heavier, more fragile, and infinitely more lasting.